Hello, welcome to the first lesson in the hormonal communication unit of Module 5. This module builds on the work that we did earlier this year, looking at the nervous system and how the nervous system allowed us to react to changes in the internal and external surroundings. What we're going to do now is look at another body system that works alongside the nervous system, and that's the endocrine system. Now, we talked briefly about this when we looked at fight or flight responses in the animal and plant responses unit that we've just completed, but this is going to kind of develop on some of those ideas in a lot more detail. So what we're going to do to start with is just have a bit of a recap from GCSE about what you should know about the endocrine system. So if you have a look at the diagram, you should be able to possibly identify some glands which make up the endocrine system. Perhaps you can see if you can complete those sentences. So just take a second to think about what you would expect those terms to be. So, what you should be able to recall is that hormones are the chemical messengers that are the kind of key elements of the endocrine system, and they are simply chemicals. We'll look at the type of chemicals that make up hormones in later on in this presentation. These hormones are secreted by glands. So your endocrine system is made up of a sequence of glands. We'll talk about each one individually shortly. And it's those glands that produce these chemicals. These chemicals are then transported around the body in the blood, and their site of action is known as the target organ or maybe even the target tissue. And we'll look at how they mediate their action when they get to those different tissues. So if you have a look on this body outline here, you can see that this is actually a representation with both male and female parts. Obviously, lots of gland tissue of the endocrine system is common to both, but we do get some parts that are only found in one sex or the other. So what we're going to do is have a look at each of these glands on here, see which ones that you already know, and we're going to talk about the hormones produced by each one. So if we work from the top, one that you should recognise is the pituitary gland, often referred to at GCSE as the master gland. We've already met it earlier this year when we talked about its production of ADH or antidiuretic hormone. It also produces another big group of hormones called the gonadotrophin hormones. That would be what you would remember from GCSE as things like LH and FSH. And we've also got growth hormone. Another another gland found in the endocrine system are the pineal glands. Now, the pineal gland is one that's located in the brain, kind of slightly behind the pituitary gland, and that produces the hormone melatonin. Now, melatonin you might have heard of in association with regulation of your circadian rhythm, or basically your ability to your cycles of sleepiness and wakefulness. Some people who are having sleep problems will take artificial injections of melatonin to try and regulate their kind of sleep processes. So, a really important hormone there. Working down the diagram, we've got your thyroid gland that produces a couple of different hormones, but predominantly the one you would know about is thyroxine. Thyroxine is fundamental for regulating your basal metabolic rate. So basically, the speed at which you carry out respiration and that kind of digestion and breakdown of food, and then use of those chemical molecules in the process of respiration to provide energy for reactions that cells would need. Thyroxine's also got a significant role in growth as well. It can affect protein synthesis, it will affect cell differentiation, bone development, lots of different functions there for the thyroid gland. Working onto the other side, a new one that you might not have heard of, or you might recognize from when we did the immunity topic, that is the thymus gland. And this one produces the hormone thymosin. Now, thymosin is a hormone that promotes production and maturation of white blood cells. So, really important when we're thinking about the immune response. So, that is your thymus gland, not to be confused with your thyroid gland. Working down, we've got a gland, or actually two glands, we're obviously only labelled one on one side, are the adrenal glands that we talked a lot about when we talked about fight or flight response. We're going to refer to them again later on in this lesson. They obviously produce the hormones adrenaline. We're going to see what other hormones are produced by the adrenal glands though as well this lesson. And then onto the other side, this organ here is your pancreas. Slightly unusual representation of the pancreas on this diagram, but you'll recognise back from GCSE that the pancreas produces the hormones insulin and glucagon, those two really important hormones in regulating your blood glucose levels. Remember, when your blood glucose levels go too high, your body releases that insulin to promote the uptake and use of glucose in respiration and the storage of that glucose as glycogen, so we lower down our blood glucose levels. Glucagon does the opposite, so when your blood glucose levels are too low, it's going to be released and it's going to try and act at places like the liver and the muscle to break down stores of glycogen into glucose or promote the production of glucose from other sources. And we'll look at that in a lot more detail next lesson. Here we get to the point where we look at both the difference between the male and the female endocrine organs. So obviously in females, we've got the ovary. I think this diagram shows the label for the ovary a little bit low, it should be a bit higher up. And that ovary produces the hormones estrogen and progesterone. So estrogen is really significant in the buildup of the lining of the uterus. It also inhibits the production of some of the gonadotrophins and stimulates production of other gonadotrophins. And then we've got progesterone. Progesterone is a hormone that's produced by the empty egg follicle, and it's responsible for maintaining the lining of that uterus and also inhibiting some of the gonadotrophins. Okay, so these hormones are kind of really significant in terms of their function. Onto the opposite side here, we've got the testes, and we know the testes will produce testosterone. Testosterone primarily responsible for sperm production, but also development of those secondary sexual characteristics, things like development of pubic hair, development of the sort of change in body shape, changing of the voice box, and those changes that we see during puberty. So what I would like you to do is using page 382 in your booklet, in your caboodle textbook, you have got in your booklet on page 1 a outline of the endocrine glands on a diagram. What I'd like you to do next to each hormone next to each gland that's shown on that diagram, I'd like you to put down the hormone or hormones that are produced and the functions of that hormone. So if you annotate around that diagram. That'd be great. Pause the video until you've done that. There's something a little bit extra to think about when we think about the pituitary gland. And you don't need to know too much more about the pituitary gland. This is more just kind of about interest, is that the pituitary gland sits very close to your hypothalamus. You can see, if you look at that diagram on the left-hand side, you've got the hypothalamus sitting slightly above the pituitary gland. They sit really close together to ensure that you get that element of interaction between nervous responses and hormonal responses. Now, what often happens if we look at the hypothalamus, it will produce a hormones. For example, the neurosecretory cells of the hypothalamus produce the ADH and the oxytocin. Remember, oxytocin is the one that's involved in making the uterus contract when a mum is going through labour, and then ADH, that one that's involved in regulation of our blood water potential. So those are produced in the hypothalamus, and then those hormones will then move down axons, these specialized kind of cells here, the axons of those cells, and be released into the bloodstream through the posterior pituitary gland. Okay, that can then travel to that hormone will then travel in the blood to the different places where it needs to have its action. So oxytocin acting at the uterus, and the mammary glands, and antidiuretic hormone obviously acting at the kidney tubules. We can see that the hypothalamus is the pituitary gland is divided into two parts. We've got the posterior pituitary and the anterior pituitary. Okay, so when we have the anterior pituitary, what we see is that the hormones here will be released into the bloodstream. Okay, and these hormones will often actually act at other areas to cause another area to release its hormones. So if we take the anterior pituitary hormones, something like LH and FSH are released from the anterior pituitary gland. They will then, these are our gonadotrophic hormones, they will then go to the ovaries and to the testes and have their actions there. The anterior pituitary gland will also release growth hormone, which actually acts directly rather than causing another hormone to be released. And then we've got, really importantly, the adrenocorticotropic hormone, or ACTH. Now, that's a precursor hormone that then goes to the adrenal glands and causes the adrenal glands to release the hormones that it has. So when we talk about the pituitary gland as a master gland, it's because it's kind of mediating lots of different responses. So the specification, particularly for this section, says that we need to know about kind of where hormones are produced, how they have their action, and then a particular focus on the hormones of the adrenal gland, which we've talked about quite a lot already, but we'll kind of look at them in a little bit more detail. Okay. So when we think about hormones, we know way back from GCSE that they are chemicals that are going to be secreted into the blood to stimulate their target cells. So they're always produced by a gland and they always travel by the blood. Now, what we know is that each hormone is going to only act at specific cells, and those will be cells that have a particular receptor that hormone can bind onto. Okay, those receptors might be either on the cell surface or they might be within the cells themselves. When we think about the hormonal system or endocrine system, we're often asked to make comparisons between the hormone and the nervous system. And when we think about a hormonal response, in general terms, the responses are much slower, so they take more time to come about, they are much longer lasting, and they're much more widespread responses. If we think about the action of adrenaline, adrenaline has an action that it has on the heart, it's going to be acting at the smooth muscle of the bronchioles, it's going to be acting at smooth muscle of blood vessels, it's going to be, it's got a sort of numerous effects. So we think of hormonal responses as slow, long lasting, and widespread compared to our nervous responses. Now, if we look what hormones are made up of, there's actually different groups of hormones, and we can think of them as sort of steroid and non-steroid hormones. So when we're talking about steroids, we're talking about lipid-based substances. Then we can have some that are proteins, glycoproteins, or simple polypeptide chains. Some of them might be amines or tyrosine derivatives. So there are different groups. Doesn't matter which they are, they're always going to be secreted directly into the blood. But once they travel in that blood to the target cell that they're going to act at, their action will be different depending on what type of what type of chemical they're made of. Okay, and so we'll look at those in a more detail in just a second. What I'd like you to do, just thinking about what we've covered on this PowerPoint, just have a go at answering the summary questions at the end of the section on page 1 in your booklet. So pause the video again and just have a go at those 3 questions there. So if we think about the way that hormones actually have their effect on their target cells and tissues, we know that regardless of what type of hormone it is, it's always got to bind to a specific receptor. And when we talk about receptor specificity, we're always talking about interaction of complementary shapes. That's always the situation. If we look at steroid hormones first, they work in quite a distinct way because steroid hormones are lipid soluble. And because they're lipid soluble, when they get to their target tissue, they're going to be able to cross through the phospholipid membrane of that target tissue and bind directly onto receptors either in that cell's cytoplasm or actually directly in the nucleus. Now, once the lipid-soluble hormone has bound to the receptor, it forms the unimaginatively named hormone receptor complex. That's when the events that sort of initiate the actual how the cell's going to respond occur. So, steroid hormones tend to work by when you form that hormone receptor complex, so the hormone binds with the receptor, that hormone receptor complex will then, inside the nucleus, act as a transcription factor. Okay, so you can see on the diagram here, it's bound to the DNA molecule. The way that it would work would either be to facilitate or to inhibit transcription of a particular gene. So if we take maybe something like FSH, so follicle stimulating hormone, the one that causes eggs to mature in ovaries, one of the other things that FSH does is stimulate the production of estrogen. So FSH would come along, it would pass directly through the phospholipid bilayer of the cells within the ovarian tissue. It would then bind onto a specific receptor to form that FSH receptor complex. That would bind then to a section of DNA to act as a transcription factor, where it would facilitate or the turning on of a gene that codes for production of estrogen, because we know FSH stimulates estrogen production. Other hormones work as transcription factors in kind of an inhibitory manner, so they'll prevent the production, and that's how they kind of mediate their response. Now, non-steroid hormones are different, and we've looked at this before when we've looked at the action of adrenaline. We're going to sort of just as this is going to be a quick recap, but remember, non-steroid hormones are hydrophilic, so they are going to be repelled by those fatty acid tails and cannot pass directly through the plasma membrane. So they work by what's called the second messenger system. So the hormone, and in this example here, we've got adrenaline, is going to act as a first messenger, and it's going to trigger the production of a second messenger through a cascade of reactions. Now, although you need to be able to know this example for adrenaline, you also need to be able to recognize that other hormones can work in a very similar way through this second messenger system. So if we just remind ourselves of this diagram that we looked at last time, we know the hormone's going to bind to that receptor within the phospholipid membrane. So there you can see the little purple square would be the receptor protein within the membrane. Now remember, that is a G protein coupled receptor, okay? So once the receptor has got the hormone bound to it, it's going to activate a G protein. That causes a conformational change or a change in shape. And as a result of that change in shape, you're going to activate an enzyme. Now, in this situation, the enzyme is going to be adenyl cyclase. Okay. This activated enzyme is then going to cause the conversion of ATP to cyclic AMP. Now, cyclic AMP is our second messenger in the system. Now, depending on what situation we're in, that cyclic AMP is going to then mediate another cascade of events by binding to different groups of enzymes called protein kinases. And what tends to happen if we take, for example, in adrenaline situation, the protein kinase that would be activated when we've got the cyclic AMP in this situation would be called glycogen phosphorylase. And this would catalyze the conversion of glycogen to glucose. So the hormone itself, that original adrenaline, didn't actually go anywhere into the cell, but it mediated its effect and what was going to occur in that cell by activating that second messenger system. So the exam board says specifically that you need to know in detail about the structure and function of the adrenal glands as our kind of focus gland within the endocrine system. We've talked about the adrenal glands briefly before when we looked at the fight or flight response. We're going to look at these in a little bit more detail now. So what you can see is your adrenal glands. Remember, these were the ones that sit on top like little hats on top of your kidneys. The adrenal glands are divided into two sections, what we call the adrenal cortex and the adrenal medulla. Okay, so the adrenal medulla is that sort of central area. Looks a little bit like a section through a piece of Toblerone, doesn't it? The adrenal medulla is the central area, and then you've got the adrenal cortex round the edge. Now, from the adrenal medulla, we have two hormones released, adrenaline and noradrenaline. Now, adrenaline we've heard a lot about before as our fight or flight hormone. We know that it increases the heart rate, so you get more oxygenated blood carrying glucose to the muscle and brain when we need it in an emergency situation. It's going to cause relaxation of the smooth muscles surrounding your bronchioles. As a result, you're going to open up the airways more and therefore get more oxygen-rich air to your alveoli for gas exchange. It's going to dilate your pupils, so therefore you're going to be able to get much more light information into your eye. It, through the action that we've just talked about as a peptide hormone, is going to stimulate through the second messenger system the conversion of glycogen to glucose in the liver, and it's also going to inhibit those unnecessary processes like peristalsis in the gut, which are not required when we're in an emergency situation. Noradrenaline has very similar actions, again from the adrenal medulla, um, released in response to stress, and has very, very similar physiological effects on the body. Okay, similar to adrenaline. Now, the adrenal cortex is a region that we've not talked about before, and your adrenal cortex releases two big groups of hormones, what we call our mineralocorticoid hormones and our glucocorticoid hormones. Now, the key mineralocorticoid that you need to know about is a hormone called aldosterone. Okay, and aldosterone has a function to control the concentration of sodium and potassium ions in the blood. Now, in doing that, it allows you to control your blood pressure by balancing. If you balance the salt levels in your body, you also balance the water levels in your blood and your tissue fluid. Now, you don't need to know too much more information than that basic bit, but if you have a look at this diagram, it kind of shows you what goes on in what we call the renin-angiotensin system. And what we can see is that if you were to get a drop in blood pressure or a drop in blood volume, then your kidneys would detect that and release a hormone called renin. That then converts another chemical produced by the liver, which then converts another one, which converts another one, to eventually get your adrenal glands to produce aldosterone. Now, aldosterone has two ways that it can raise your blood pressure back up. One is by acting directly on the kidneys to stimulate the reabsorption of salts. And therefore, if you reabsorb more salt, you're going to reabsorb more water. And as a result, that's going to restore your blood volume a little bit more. And then, as part of that system, you're also going to act on blood vessels to basically cause their constriction or their narrowing to therefore increase that blood pressure back up. So that's your mineralocorticoids, and aldosterone is the one that you need to know the example for. Glucocorticoids are our next group, and you'll have recognized a glucocorticoid. Okay, so glucocorticoids, e.g., cortisol. Okay, so we've heard about cortisol before. It's a key one that's involved in controlling metabolism of carbohydrates and fats and proteins in the liver. It's also a stress hormone, okay, but probably our longer term stress hormone. And its action in terms of that stress response is to stimulate the production of glucose from glycogen. So breaking down those glycogen stores, those fat stores, and proteins back into glucose. It's also got quite a big responsibility in regulating blood pressure and cardiovascular function in response to stress. There's another hormone that's quite closely linked to cortisol called corticosterone. That's another example of a glucocorticoid, and it works alongside cortisol to regulate your immune response and suppress your inflammatory response. So you've got a couple of different hormones. Now, these ones here are, remember, not from the medulla, these are from the adrenal cortex. So from the outer region, you've got your mineralocorticoids like aldosterone and your glucocorticoids like cortisol and corticosterone. What we'd like you to do then is to pause the video and, using your textbook and the notes we've just gone through here, have a go at completing page 3 in your booklet. Make sure you've got on your diagram clear labels of the adrenal cortex and the adrenal medulla. And then for each part of your adrenal gland, describe the hormone produced by that gland and the effects that that hormone has in the body. So far we've only talked about endocrine glands. Now, there is also another type of glandular tissue called exocrine glands, and these are present throughout the body. They can actually be, some of our glandular tissue has both an exocrine and an endocrine component to it. Now, the difference with exocrine glands is that these glands, this tissue here, secretes a product, but instead of secreting it into the blood, they release it into tiny tubes called ducts. Okay, remember when we talked about the liver, a duct is kind of basically a tube. And these tubes then carry that product directly to the target cells. Okay, now that target cell could be in an internal part of the body or on an external surface of the body. Exocrine glands don't produce hormones, but it's kind of other secretory products. So if we think about the mammary glands, their role is to secrete breast milk, and that's secreted directly onto the surface of the breast. We've got the gastric glands that you'd find in, for example, in your stomach, that are going to secrete the gastric juice onto the stomach lining. We've got your sebaceous glands, and the sebaceous glands would be the glands that are going to secrete like the oily sort of sebum substance directly onto the skin surface. So we're not talking about hormones here, but we are talking about other really useful chemicals. And when they're released, it doesn't go into the blood, it goes directly into a tube and then goes to where it's needed. Now, if we have a look at this diagram, this shows all the different glands of the body. We recognise that some of these are exocrine and some of these are endocrine. Okay, so just take a look for a minute and see if you can work out, right, which of these glands or tissues would be exocrine and which would be endocrine. So the pituitary gland is an endocrine one, thyroid is endocrine, adrenal is obviously endocrine, pancreas has got an endocrine function when we're talking about its production of insulin and glucagon. Ovaries is endocrine, testes is endocrine, but when we talk about the pancreas in terms of its missed one out, gone back up to the top, salivary glands. They've got an exocrine function, so that glandular tissue there is going to produce the digestive enzymes, it's going to produce the bicarbonate neutralizing solution that tries to neutralize them in your mouth. Then we've got the liver with its exocrine function. The glandular tissue of the stomach is going to be exocrine, and then the pancreas with its second role as an exocrine organ. So when we look at the pancreas next lesson, it will be a bit more important to know the difference between the exocrine and the endocrine tissue. So, a few different things I'd like you to do now. First one is to have a quick recap comparing hormonal and neuronal responses. Okay, so work through the table that you've got in your work booklet. It's on page 4 of your booklet. You've got to compare the hormonal or the endocrine system and the nervous system in terms of how the communication occurs, route of transmission, speed, how specific the message is, what the response is like, how quick response, length of response, and overall effect. So have a go at doing that, and then a couple of slides on, you'll be able to check your answers. So have a look through. Hopefully that should be fairly straightforward. I think we've talked through something very similar before, but often exam questions will ask you to make these comparisons. On this slide here is just the link to the crash course on the endocrine system if you're interested in going further. Remember, it's that bloke who speaks really quite quickly. He gives a good summary of the endocrine system. So what I'd like you to do now in a couple of activities to do in terms of follow-up, you've got an exam question to have a go at in terms of adrenaline's action, where we can see adrenaline and how it mediates its action as a second messenger molecule. And then you've got an exam question to cover about hormonal and nervous mechanisms involved in controlling heart rate. So we'd have a go at both of those exam questions. You've got the answers on the slides that follow, so make sure that you have done your questions and you've checked your answers. I'd like you to email me a mark out of a mark question. Okay, so that one's out of 10 or better. I've put on there a model answer to that question should you ready to check it. Then you've got some independent study questions to carry out in your caboodle booklet. I've put the answers on the next slides. And then in your booklet, you've just got on page on page 7 of your booklet, you've just got a quick review of all the hormones that we've talked about. Okay, so hopefully you've got plenty of those things that you will be able to work through. You've got all the answers that you should need. I'm going to set you a quick show my homework quiz just to check you've got all your subject knowledge up and running once we've done it. And then there'll be an opportunity to ask any questions about it at the end of the lesson.